Well, hello, and it is time for us to consider the book of Leviticus. Hard to believe already. Here we are just 1 month into the year, and we're already into the third book of the Bible. We're in the book of Leviticus. Now, let me just say a word about that real quick. I know that there's a lot of, just descriptions about how to slaughter animals. There's blood flying all over the place. Plus, it can kind of get sort of dull reading through it, and the questions of why is this relevant for me today can certainly come up. But I just want to remind you that all of this was meant to give a picture of Christ, to give a picture of Jesus and what his sacrifice on the cross meant for us. And so I think it's important then to just take time as you're reading through to think about the severity of sin. First and foremost, I think that's something that's very relevant in reading through reading through Leviticus, is the fact that the severity of sin and how sin divides us from God and separates us from God is definitely illustrated quite visibly there, and that's what I think the Israelites were meant to see. They bring their animal to the sacrifice. Blood is being splattered everywhere. Things are being burnt on the altar, and all of this was meant to help them understand what sin does. That sin it divides us from God. It separates us from God. It brings suffering into our lives, and so these animals were the substitutes in place of the people. But I want us to think about the three functions of sacrifice, and I'm indebted to Tremper Longman, who wrote a book called Seeing Christ in Israel's Worship. And so he talks about the three functions of sacrifice. One of them was atonement. That's probably one of the most important, was the atonement. He writes that the atonement is arguably the most fundamental function of sacrifice. Atonement is an English word contrived from the phrase "at one ment." So, in other words, if you think of that as three separate words, "at one ment," then it kind of illustrates more of what's going on in the atonement. The idea behind it is this: that sin has created a break in the relationship between God and human subjects. And so the sacrifice of atonement, then, is an integral part of the ritual, that it reestablishes the unity between God and humans. So I think that certainly is helpful for us to think of. Now, the word atone in Hebrew, it's not exactly certain where that word comes from. There are two theories. One is that it comes from an Akkadian word, meaning to wipe clean or to wipe off. And the other theory is that it comes from an Arabic word meaning to conceal or to cover. I think both those ideas are certainly present in the biblical understanding of atonement. Really, I think they're both in the mix there for certain. But I think the most important thing for us to understand is that sin is being dealt with to restore the relationship. That's what atonement means. So I think "at one ment" is really helpful for us to think about. The second thing is the sacrifices served as a gift. That was another significance of it, a gift to God. Of course, God does not need our gifts. God is not dependent on us. He does not derive any kind of sustenance from us. Pagan gods often were seen as being thirsty and hungry. And so the people saw themselves as offering sacrifices to their gods in order to feed them. That is not the sense at all that we should get from the sacrifices here in the Old Testament, here in Leviticus. But certainly, God as our King is deserving of gifts. We bring tribute to him. We bring gifts to him as a way of expressing our gratitude, as a way of expressing our love. And it is very clear also that he does, in some sense, derive pleasure from receiving gifts from us. So, and I think that's true even today. God does receive pleasure from the offering of gifts that we give. Also, another function or another significance of the sacrifices was fellowship and communion. Some sacrifices emphasize the fact that we're having a relationship with God, that there's communion with Him, communion between God and the worshiper, but also between the worshipers generally and the priestly community in particular. So this aspect of sacrifice is highlighted in that not all of the offering is devoted to God, but certain designated parts of the sacrifice could be eaten by the circle of worshipers. So we'll see that as well in Leviticus, that some of the sacrifices were brought, offered, and the people were to eat it right there. The priests were to eat it as well. It was part of how they were taken care of. And so that's what's happening. It's not just fellowship with God, but fellowship with one another. Now, the next thing I want to talk about a little bit is about this burnt offering. You see this there in the beginning. That's the very first sacrifice described in Leviticus. Chapter 1 is the burnt offering sacrifice. By virtue of its coming first in the list, we can assume its importance and that it will be confirmed by our examination of its meanings, says Tremper Longman. With the exception of the Day of Atonement, where the sin offering took center space or place, the burnt offering sacrifice was the most important sacrifice at Israelite festivals. Perhaps even more importantly, the burnt offering was offered twice each day, once in the morning and once in the evening. But first, how should we translate this term, olah? It is often translated, as I've said, whole offering or burnt offering. And while this is a good description of the procedure of the sacrifice, it is not what the Hebrew term means. It actually means the rising up and must refer to the smoke that rose from the altar during the ritual. The smoke rose from the earth into the heavens, where God pronounced it very pleasing. So again, that highlights the fact that God did receive pleasure from these sacrifices. Not that He needed them, but it pleased Him in a certain sense. I think that, considering also that this burnt offering was offered twice a day was a constant reminder. And you'll see this. I mean, there's always sacrifices being offered. Constantly, continually. What does that make us think about in terms of our own sin and our own need to make things right with God on a regular basis? I think that's what it was meant to remind them of constantly, that we're always running into the issues of breaching that relationship. And the sacrifices being offered continually, day by day, or morning and evening, burnt offering sacrifices. What does that say to us then about even our own devotional life, about our own prayer life, about how we approach God throughout our day? Also, a few questions that maybe we can think of in relation to these sacrifices. Let me just scroll down to some reflection questions here. Think about the burnt offering. What was it about that made it a foundational sacrifice? What does atonement mean to you theologically and personally? Why were there different sacrifices and not just one? Think about that. And fourth, the burnt offering was foundational to the Old Testament worship. Is there anything so foundational in today's worship? So look at all these sacrifices, all these different kinds of sacrifices, the three areas of significance involving the sacrifice of atonement, of gifts, and also of communion and fellowship. Where do we see those paralleled or mirrored in Old Testament worship? How are they similar, but also how are they different? How is Old Testament worship, New Testament worship different today as well? So these are just some things to think about as you read through Leviticus. Also, don't get discouraged reading through it. Sometimes when people begin reading through the Bible in a year, this is where we hit a brick wall. And if they make it through that wall, they hit another one in Numbers. Don't get discouraged. Just keep plodding through, keep pushing through. It might be dry at times. You might feel like, I'm not sure what all this means. But just remember to pray through it as well. Ask God to show you something that maybe is not immediately obvious, to help you see Christ really in all of these sacrifices and all of these rituals. All of it is meant to point us to Him. So that's all I have for today. So God bless you in your reading through the Word.